I was 17 years old when I realized that surviving a tragedy doesn't mean you're safe from cruelty. People think the worst moment of my life was the night my parents died in a car accident. They imagine flashing lights, a ringing phone, a police officer standing in the doorway. And yes, those moments shattered me. But what came after was quieter, slower, and somehow more damaging. I didn't move in with strangers. I didn't end up in the foster system. I moved in with family. My uncle told everyone he was saving me. 8 months later, his family would say I destroyed their marriage. At the time, I didn't understand how quickly gratitude can turn into a weapon, how mourning can be seen as weakness, how a girl who has lost everything can become an inconvenience simply by existing in the wrong house. I tried to be invisible. I tried to be grateful. I tried to take up as little space as possible. It didn't matter, because when people decide you don't belong, no amount of silence will protect you. There were no bruises, no screaming matches at first, just locked doors that didn't open, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, things disappearing, looks that told me I was tolerated, not wanted. And then one afternoon, I came home and found the last pieces of my parents scattered across the floor like trash. That was the moment something inside me broke. I didn't scream for help. I didn't call the police. I didn't know I was standing at the beginning of a chain reaction that would tear a family apart. Because when you're 17 and grieving, you don't expose secrets to destroy lives. You do it to survive. And sometimes the truth doesn't just save you. Sometimes it burns everything else to the ground. My name is Mia. I was 17 when my life split into two versions of itself, before the accident and after. Before, I was the kind of girl who complained about normal teenage things, homework, group projects, my mom insisting I bring a jacket even when it wasn't that cold, my dad asking the same three questions every evening. Did you eat? Did you finish your assignments? Are you okay? Like he could keep me safe just by repeating them. Before, I lived in Seattle, in a small house that never felt big, but always felt full. My parents weren't perfect. We argued sometimes. My mom got stressed. My dad worked too much. But the house was ours, and I never doubted that if I walked into the kitchen at midnight, someone would wake up and ask if I wanted tea. After, I learned what real silence sounds like. The accident happened 8 months ago. People always ask the same question. Was it quick? Did they suffer? As if knowing the details could make it less unbearable. I don't remember most of that night. I remember my phone vibrating, the number being unfamiliar, my body already cold before I even answered. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed with the screen glowing against my hands and thinking, this is not real. This cannot be real. I'll wake up and they'll still be downstairs. But I didn't wake up into the same world. The days after the funeral were like walking through fog with weights tied to my ankles. Everyone said things like, they're in a better place, and they would want you to be strong, and I nodded. Because that's what you do when you're numb, and people expect you to perform grief in a way that makes them comfortable. The hardest part wasn't the crying. It was the moments in between. The empty seat at this table, the smell of my dad's jacket still hanging in the closet, my mom's handwriting on sticky notes in the kitchen, little reminders everywhere that life had been normal just days earlier. And then came the practical question that didn't care about my feelings. Where was I going to live? My dad had a brother, my uncle. His name was Hudson, and he was 52. We weren't close, not the way families in movies are. He and my dad weren't the type to call every day. They weren't enemies either. They were men who loved each other quietly, from a distance. Holiday texts, occasional phone calls, a birthday message with a thumbs up emoji. But after the funeral, Hudson stepped forward. He told me I wouldn't have to go into the foster system. He said I could come live with him in Portland with his wife Gianna, 49, and their two kids, Rachel, 15, and Danny, 19. I remember being at a table in a back room after the service. People's voices sounded muffled, like I was underwater. Hudson sat across from me, his hands folded, trying to look calm. Your family, he said. You won't be alone. I clung to those words like they were a life raft. Because when you've lost your parents, the idea of being passed around strangers feels like being erased. I didn't want another house, another set of rules, another family looking at me like a charity case. So when Hudson offered, I said yes. I told myself it was a blessing. I told myself it was safe. Looking back, there's one moment I can't stop replaying. When Hudson made the offer, Gianna's face didn't soften. She didn't smile. She didn't reach for my hand. She just stared, not with sympathy, with calculation. Like she was measuring how much space I would take up in her home, in her family, in her life. I noticed it, but I dismissed it. because I wanted to believe in the version of the story where family steps up. The move happened fast. I packed my life into boxes, photo albums, letters, a small jewelry box that held my mom's things, pieces of her that I couldn't replace, some of my dad's books with his notes in the margins. I didn't have much that mattered anymore, but what I did have, I protected like it was oxygen. When I arrived in Portland, Hudson stood in the driveway like he was determined to prove he'd made the right choice. He helped carry my bags, showed me the guest bathroom, pointed out where the cereal was kept, like he could make it feel normal by narrating it. Gianna stayed inside. Rachel hovered behind her, half curious, half annoyed. Danny, 19, grown enough to shave and drive and go out with friends, didn't even look at me properly. Hudson tried to lighten it. "Danny, you'll be sharing your room for a while," he said. Danny gave the smallest shrug I've ever seen, like I wasn't a person, like I was a piece of furniture being moved in. "Whatever," he muttered, and walked away. My suitcase sat in the hallway, and I remember thinking, okay, they're adjusting. It's fine. I'm the outsider. I have to be patient. That was the mindset I carried for months. I tried to be easy. I tried to be grateful. I tried to shrink myself down into something that wouldn't bother anyone. I cleaned up after myself. I stayed out of the way. I offered to help with dishes. I kept my grief quiet because I didn't want to make the air heavy in a house that already felt cold. And still, the house never warmed up to me. Gianna and Rachel spoke Spanish constantly, even when I was sitting right there. Hudson would ask them to switch to English, and they would, briefly, then slip back like it was a game they were determined to win. At first, I told myself it was just habit. Then I started catching words. And I realized I was the topic more often than not. Not my name, never my name. Just she, the girl, that one. Danny would act like I didn't exist unless he needed something. If I tried to speak, he'd glance past me like I was air. If Hudson asked him to help me move a box or show me where something was, he'd sigh like he was being punished. Gianna would make dinner and somehow forget to make enough. "Oh," she'd say, blinking innocently when I stood awkwardly by the counter. "I didn't realize." And I would smile like it didn't sting because what else was I supposed to do? Rachel complained openly about having to share space, about the upstairs bathroom, about the groceries, about how her friends thought it was weird that her cousin lived with them now. And Hudson would try. He worked long hours. He came home tired, carrying stress in his shoulders, and still he'd look around the table and force small talk, trying to stitch us together into something resembling family. But every time he turned his back, the stitches loosened. The truth is, I didn't just lose my parents. I lost my place in the world. And by the time I understood that Hudson's house wasn't a safe landing, just a different kind of storm, I was already trapped inside it. Because when you have nowhere else to go, you learn to tolerate things you should never have to tolerate. And that's exactly what Gianna counted on. At first, nothing Gianna did could be pointed to as cruel. That was the problem. Cruelty hides best when it looks like forgetfulness, like inconvenience, like small misunderstandings that add up until you're exhausted from explaining yourself. I learned quickly that if I wanted peace in that house, I had to stay quiet. Gianna didn't yell at me. She didn't threaten me. She smiled when Hudson was around and spoke to me in a polite, distant tone, like a coworker she tolerated but didn't respect. But when Hudson left for work in the morning, the air shifted. She would assign me chores without asking if I had homework. She'd inspect the kitchen afterward, finding imaginary faults. "You missed a spot," she'd say, pointing vaguely. "You should pay more attention." Rachel watched these interactions closely. Sometimes she mimicked her mother's tone, correcting me even when I hadn't done anything wrong. Other times, she would roll her eyes dramatically and whisper to Gianna in Spanish, and they'd share a look that made my stomach tighten. Danny remained mostly silent, but silence can be loud when it's intentional. When his friends came over, they took over the living room and the basement. The TV volume would spike, laughter would echo, and if I walked through to grab water or sit quietly on the couch, one of them would glance at me and say, "Hey, we're kind of using this." I'd nod. I'd apologize. I'd retreat to the bedroom I shared with Danny, careful not to touch anything that belonged to him. My world shrank to that room. Under the bed, I kept the boxes that mattered most. My parents' photo albums, letters they'd written to each other before I was born. My mom's jewelry box, with the necklace she wore almost every day. I would take them out late at night when the house was quiet and remind myself that I hadn't imagined my old life. Those moments were the only time I felt like myself. Everything else felt like I was holding my breath. Gianna noticed. She started making comments, not loud enough for Hudson to hear, but sharp enough to land. "You're very attached to the past," she said one afternoon as I carefully put a photo album back into its box. "At some point, you have to move on." I didn't answer. Rachel laughed quietly from the doorway. "I tried harder after that. I joined clubs at school so I wouldn't be home as much. I stayed late in the library. I volunteered for extra group projects just to delay going back. But avoidance doesn't solve anything when the hostility follows you." I started understanding more Spanish than they realized. Words slipped through. Cansada, tired, una carga, a burden, siempre triste, always sad. They talked about me like I was a problem Hudson had brought home without consulting them. Danny started acting different too. He wasn't openly hostile, but there was something in his eyes now. A kind of irritation mixed with satisfaction, like he knew something I didn't. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at the boxes under the bed, then quickly looking away. One afternoon, I came home to find my laundry still sitting wet in the washer. Everyone else's clothes had been folded neatly on the couch. Mine smelled sour. When I asked Gianna about it, she barely looked up from her phone. "Oh, I thought you'd take care of your own things," she said. "I didn't know you expected me to do everything for you." I washed them again, fighting the tightness in my throat. That night, Hudson noticed my red eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I nodded. I always nodded. Because how do you explain a pattern without sounding paranoid? How do you prove 1,000 tiny cuts when no single one draws blood? 3 months after I moved in, the house crossed a line I couldn't step back from. I came home from school and the bedroom door was open. That alone made my heart pound. I knew how carefully I left things. I knew the exact angle of the boxes under the bed, the way I stacked them so they wouldn't shift. My parents' photo album was on the bed. Open. The pages were empty. At first, my brain refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. Then I looked down. Photos were scattered across the floor like debris after a storm. Some were bent. Some had footprints on them. A few were torn clean in half. My mom's smile ripped straight down the middle. I dropped my backpack and fell to my knees. My hands shook as I picked up pieces of my life that had been destroyed casually, without hesitation. I ran to the jewelry box. It was empty. The necklace, my mom's necklace, was snapped in two in the trash. That was when I screamed. I yelled Danny's name until my throat burned. He came into the room slowly, like he already knew what he'd see. "What happened?" he asked. The lie was in his voice. I accused him. I didn't scream, I didn't swear. I just said his name and asked why, over and over, like there might be an explanation that made sense. He denied it flatly. We argued. Voices rose, emotions collided. And then we were pushing each other. Not playfully, not accidentally. When Gianna and Rachel came home and saw us, the story changed instantly. I wasn't a grieving girl anymore. I was a problem. A threat. And for the first time since I'd moved in, Gianna didn't hide her disgust. At first, nothing Gianna did could be pointed to as cruel. That was the problem. Cruelty hides best when it looks like forgetfulness, like inconvenience, like small misunderstandings that add up until you're exhausted from explaining yourself. I learned quickly that if I wanted peace in that house, I had to stay quiet. Gianna didn't yell at me. She didn't threaten me. She smiled when Hudson was around and spoke to me in a polite, distant tone, like a coworker she tolerated but didn't respect. But when Hudson left for work in the morning, the air shifted. She would assign me chores without asking if I had homework. She'd inspect the kitchen afterward, finding imaginary faults. "You missed a spot," she'd say, pointing vaguely. "You should pay more attention." Rachel watched these interactions closely. Sometimes she mimicked her mother's tone, correcting me even when I hadn't done anything wrong. Other times, she would roll her eyes dramatically and whisper to Gianna in Spanish, and they'd share a look that made my stomach tighten. Danny remained mostly silent, but silence can be loud when it's intentional. When his friends came over, they took over the living room and the basement. The TV volume would spike. Laughter would echo. And if I walked through to grab water or sit quietly on the couch, one of them would glance at me and say, "Hey, we're kind of using this." I'd nod. I'd apologize. I'd retreat to the bedroom I shared with Danny, careful not to touch anything that belonged to him. My world shrank to that room. Under the bed, I kept the boxes that mattered most. My parents' photo albums, letters they'd written to each other before I was born. My mom's jewelry box, with the necklace she wore almost every day. I would take them out late at night when the house was quiet and remind myself that I hadn't imagined my old life. Those moments were the only time I felt like myself. Everything else felt like I was holding my breath. Gianna noticed. She started making comments, not loud enough for Hudson to hear, but sharp enough to land. "You're very attached to the past," she said one afternoon, as I carefully put a photo album back into its box. "At some point, you have to move on." I didn't answer. Rachel laughed quietly from the doorway. I tried harder after that. I joined clubs at school so I wouldn't be home as much. I stayed late in the library. I volunteered for extra group projects just to delay going back. But avoidance doesn't solve anything when the hostility follows you. I started understanding more Spanish than they realized. Words slipped through. Cansada, tired, una carga, a burden, siempre triste, always sad. They talked about me like I was a problem Hudson had brought home without consulting them. Danny started acting different too. He wasn't openly hostile, but there was something in his eyes now, a kind of irritation mixed with satisfaction, like he knew something I didn't. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at the boxes under the bed, then quickly looking away. One afternoon, I came home to find my laundry still sitting wet in the washer. Everyone else's clothes had been folded neatly on the couch. Mine smelled sour. When I asked Gianna about it, she barely looked up from her phone. "Oh, I thought you'd take care of your own things," she said. "I didn't know you expected me to do everything for you." I washed them again, fighting the tightness in my throat. That night, Hudson noticed my red eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I nodded. I always nodded. Because how do you explain a pattern without sounding paranoid? How do you prove 1,000 tiny cuts when no single one draws blood? 3 months after I moved in, the house crossed a line I couldn't step back from. I came home from school and the bedroom door was open. That alone made my heart pound. I knew how carefully I left things. I knew the exact angle of the boxes under the bed, the way I stacked them so they wouldn't shift. My parents' photo album was on the bed. Open. The pages were empty. At first, my brain refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. Then I looked down. Photos were scattered across the floor like debris after a storm. Some were bent. Some had footprints on them. A few were torn clean in half. My mom's smile ripped straight down the middle. I dropped my backpack and fell to my knees. My hands shook as I picked up pieces of my life that had been destroyed casually, without hesitation. I ran to the jewelry box. It was empty. The necklace, my mom's necklace, was snapped in two in the trash. That was when I screamed. I yelled Danny's name until my throat burned. He came into the room slowly, like he already knew what he'd see. "What happened?" he asked. The lie was in his voice. I accused him. I didn't scream. I didn't swear. I just said his name and asked why, over and over, like there might be an explanation that made sense. He denied it flatly. We argued. Voices rose. Emotions collided. And then we were pushing each other. Not playfully, not accidentally. When Gianna and Rachel came home and saw us, the story changed instantly. I wasn't a grieving girl anymore. I was a problem. A threat. And for the first time since I'd moved in, Gianna didn't hide her disgust. After the night I was locked outside in the rain, something inside me shut down. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was quieter than that. I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped believing that if I explained myself clearly enough, someone would finally understand. Because I had explained. In pieces. In silences. In the way my grades slipped and my appetite disappeared. In the way I flinched when footsteps passed my door at night. Hudson apologized for what he called a mix-up. He brought me soup and asked if I was warm enough. His voice was gentle, and I hated how much that made me want to cry. Because kindness after neglect feels confusing, like you're supposed to be grateful for crumbs. I told him I was fine. That became my default answer. Fine meant I'm surviving. Fine meant please don't look closer. Fine meant I don't have the energy to convince you. The house felt smaller after that. The walls pressed in. Every sound felt amplified. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of Spanish drifting down the hall, the laughter from Danny's room when his friends came over like nothing had happened. I started timing my movements. I waited until the kitchen was empty to eat. I memorized Gianna's schedule so I could avoid her. I learned which floorboards creaked and which didn't. At night, I lay awake listening. I listened for doors opening, for voices outside my room, for the sound of someone touching the boxes under the bed. I started sleeping with my backpack next to me, my phone charger, wallet, school ID inside, like I might need to leave quickly. I hated myself for that. I hated that I didn't feel safe in a house that was supposed to be my second chance. My grades dropped next. Teachers pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said I was adjusting. I joined study groups just to stay out of the house longer. The library became my refuge until it closed. I lost weight without trying. Food tasted like nothing. Anxiety sat heavy in my chest, making it hard to swallow. Some nights I lay there counting my breaths because my heart felt like it was racing for no reason. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. What did I do wrong? Was I too sad, too quiet, too much? Or was my existence alone the problem? Hudson tried to fix things the only way he knew how, by forcing normalcy. Family dinners, weekend outings, movie nights. They were unbearable. Gianna participated with tight smiles. Rachel complained the entire time. Danny stared at his phone. No one spoke to me unless prompted. It felt like being displayed, like proof that Hudson was trying, even if no one else was. Eventually, I stopped going. Hudson noticed. "You should come with us," he said one evening, standing in the doorway of the bedroom. "It might help." Help who? I wanted to ask. Me, or the illusion that this family still functioned. Then came the weekend that changed everything. Hudson's coworker, Tom, and his wife, Laura, invited me to stay with them for a few days. I'd met them before at work events. Kind people, easy smiles, the kind who ask questions and actually listen to the answers. I almost said no. Saying yes felt dangerous, like hope. But that weekend felt like oxygen. They had a guest room ready. They asked what I liked to eat. They didn't treat me like a problem to manage or a favor they were doing. We watched movies, played board games, went out without tension thickening the air. For the first time in months, I laughed without forcing it. When Tom dropped me back off at Hudson's house, Gianna's smile was thin, controlled. And that night, Tom texted Hudson. I didn't know what he said exactly, only that Hudson came into my room the next day looking conflicted. "Are you happy here?" he asked. The question felt like a trap. I chose my words carefully. I said I was grateful. I said I knew things were hard. I didn't say I was drowning. Hudson nodded. "They're still adjusting," he said. "It'll get better." 2 weeks later, Tom and Kevin made an offer. They asked if I wanted to come live with them. Not temporarily, not as a favor. As a home. The relief hit so hard I had to lock myself in the bathroom and cry silently into a towel. But relief came tangled with guilt. Hudson had taken me in when no one else did, and I was about to leave. I carried the weight of that offer for days without telling anyone. Every time I looked at Hudson, guilt twisted in my stomach. He had stood up to his own family for me. He had kept me out of foster care, and now the thought of leaving felt like betrayal, like I was proving Gianna right. That I was a problem, that I didn't belong. But every night I stayed, my body reminded me of the truth. The tight chest, the shallow breathing, the way my heart raced whenever footsteps paused outside my door. I wasn't just unhappy, I was unraveling. When Hudson finally told me Tom and Kevin's offer himself, his voice was careful, neutral, like he was bracing for impact. "They said you could stay with them for a while," he said. "Finish high school, get settled." He looked at me. "What do you think?" My throat closed. I told him I needed time. We agreed to meet Tom and Kevin for lunch to talk it through. That morning, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold my fork. I sat between adults who were calm and prepared, while I felt like a child about to disappoint someone who had tried to save me. Tom explained things gently. Kevin filled in details. School transfers, space, support. Then Hudson looked directly at me. "Is this what you want?" he asked. I forced the word out. "Yes." It barely sounded like my voice. Hudson nodded. Just nodded. No questions, no fight, no attempt to fix anything. Something in me cracked at that. I had expected resistance, anger, at least confusion. Instead, he looked relieved. Like this solved a problem he didn't know how to handle. The move happened quickly. Tom and Kevin prepared the room. Kevin showed me around their home like it was normal to belong somewhere. When Tom went back to pack my things with Hudson, Gianna stayed in another room. She didn't say goodbye. Rachel and Danny weren't there. I slept for 14 hours that first night. When I woke up, it felt like my nervous system had finally shut off the alarm it had been screaming for months. Life with Tom and Kevin was different in ways I didn't even know to ask for. They asked my opinion. They noticed when I was quiet. They didn't monitor my presence like it was a burden. I could breathe, but the guilt didn't disappear. Hudson texted occasionally, polite, distant. "How are you doing? Hope you're settling in." It felt like we'd been reduced to acquaintances. Then, weeks later, everything I thought I knew shattered. I got a text from Rachel. She asked to meet at a coffee shop near my school. She looked nervous when she arrived. She kept glancing at the door like she was afraid someone would see her with me. She didn't waste time. "Danny destroyed your parents' things," she said. But it wasn't his idea. My chest went cold. She told me everything. How Gianna ordered it. How she wanted to erase reminders of my parents. How she ignored me in the rain on purpose. How they mocked me in Spanish far worse than I ever realized. I sat there, hands wrapped around a cold cup, trying to stay upright as my entire past rearranged itself. When Rachel finished, she whispered, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. That night, Tom and Kevin listened without interrupting. When I finished, Kevin said quietly, Hudson deserves to know. And suddenly, the decision wasn't just about me anymore. It was about truth and consequences. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of fear this time, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying every moment I had questioned myself. The destroyed photos, the broken necklace, the rain soaking through my clothes while I stood outside a locked door. I had doubted my own memory. I had wondered if grief had made me dramatic, if I was overreacting, if maybe I really was the problem Gianna said I was. Now I knew the truth, and somehow knowing it hurt worse, because cruelty hits differently when you realize it was intentional. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like the air was too thin. My chest felt heavy, like someone had placed a weight directly over my heart. I thought about Hudson, how he had tried, how he had defended me without ever knowing what he was really up against. I thought about how calmly Gianna had lied, how carefully, how confident she was that she'd never face consequences. If I told Hudson, it would destroy his marriage. If I didn't, it would confirm everything Gianna believed, that she could hurt people quietly and get away with it. That realization made my stomach twist. For the first time since moving out, I felt truly alone. Not unsafe, not unwanted. Just unbearably responsible. I didn't want power. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to be the reason another family broke apart. I just wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside my head. I kept thinking about the look on Hudson's face the day I said I wanted to leave. That quiet acceptance. That relief I hadn't understood at the time. What if he already suspected something was wrong? What if my silence had protected the wrong people? By morning, my head ached from crying without realizing it. Kevin made me tea and didn't ask questions. Tom squeezed my shoulder gently before leaving for work. That kindness almost broke me, because it reminded me how little I had needed to feel safe. Just honesty, just care, just someone willing to believe me. I stared at my phone for hours before finally typing Hudson's name. I asked if we could meet. He responded almost immediately. Yes, he wrote, of course. The meeting was set for the same restaurant where we'd discussed me moving out. When I walked in, Hudson looked exhausted, older somehow. His shoulders slumped like he was already carrying something heavy. We ordered drinks we barely touched. I've been meaning to check in more, he said. I hope you're okay. I swallowed hard. I am, I said. But I need to tell you something, and it's not easy. The words felt too big for my mouth. I started with Rachel. I told him what she'd said. I watched his face change in slow motion, confusion giving way to disbelief, disbelief hardening into shock. He asked me to repeat it. Then again. By the time I finished explaining everything, Gianna's instructions to Danny, the intentional cruelty, the rain, Hudson was staring at the table like it might collapse beneath him. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said quietly, "Why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was broken. I was scared, I said, and I didn't think you'd believe me, and I didn't want to make things worse. Hudson closed his eyes. I was supposed to protect you, he said, and I failed. Hearing that hurt almost as much as everything else. When we left that restaurant, I knew something irreversible had begun. I just didn't know yet how much would burn in the process. Hudson didn't call me for 3 days after our meeting. At first, I told myself that was a good thing, that he needed time, space, silence to process what I'd told him. But as the hours stretched on, doubt crept in. Old fears resurfaced, whispering that maybe I had said too much, that maybe I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Then my phone rang. It was Hudson. His voice sounded different, steady but hollow, like something inside him had already cracked. I talked to them, he said, all of them. My heart pounded so hard I had to sit down. He told me everything. At first, Gianna denied it, just like I'd expected. She said Rachel was lying. That grief had made me unstable, that I was trying to turn him against his own family. But Hudson didn't back down. He pressed her, calmly, methodically. He asked questions she wasn't prepared for. He brought up details only someone who had planned it would know. And eventually, she admitted it. Not with shame, with justification. She said she was helping you move on, Hudson told me, his voice tightening. She said you were manipulating me with your grief, that you were an outsider disrupting our family. My hands went numb. Danny broke down after that. He admitted destroying my parents' belongings. He cried. He said he hadn't wanted to do it, but he'd been pressured. That he'd felt guilty ever since, but he'd been too afraid of getting in trouble to speak up. Rachel confirmed everything. Hudson went quiet for a moment before continuing. She admitted ignoring you when you were locked out, he said. She said you needed to learn responsibility. I closed my eyes. That wasn't discipline. That was cruelty. Hudson told me the confrontation turned into the worst fight of their marriage. Gianna accused him of choosing me over his own family. She said he had created the problem by bringing me into the house in the first place. And that's when I realized, Hudson said slowly, that this wasn't about you. He told me he was considering divorce. I froze. I don't want to be the reason, I started. You're not, he interrupted firmly. This is about who she is, and who I ignored she was. For the first time, I felt something shift. The truth wasn't destroying his family, it was revealing it. A few weeks later, Hudson called again. He told me Gianna had moved out. Rachel chose to go with her. Danny stayed, but their relationship was strained. Hudson said the house felt empty in a way that was both painful and relieving. Then he asked something I didn't expect. Would you be willing to have dinner with Danny, he said, so he can apologize properly? I agreed. Not for closure, but because I finally felt strong enough to sit at the table without shrinking. The dinner was awkward. Danny cried. He apologized without excuses. I told him the truth, that what he did had hurt me deeply, but that I didn't hate him. When I left that night, I realized something important. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was standing, and the truth had given me my footing back. Once the truth was out, it didn't move quietly. It rippled. It reached into every corner of Hudson's life, into relationships that had been built on assumptions and silences, and it rearranged them in ways no one could control anymore. Gianna didn't leave gracefully. Hudson told me she cried to her sister first, framing herself as the misunderstood wife whose husband had chosen a stranger over his own family. She said I had manipulated him, that I had poisoned his mind after moving out. That grief had made me dramatic, and that Hudson had fallen for it. But the story didn't hold, not when Rachel had already admitted the truth, not when Danny had confessed, not when Hudson himself could line up every detail and see the pattern he'd missed for years. The divorce discussions escalated fast. Lawyers replaced conversations. Paperwork replaced excuses. Hudson said the most painful part wasn't the fighting. It was realizing how long he had enabled Gianna by choosing peace over accountability. Rachel cut contact with him almost immediately. She sent one short message before leaving with her mother. You chose her over us. Hudson showed it to me without comment. His hands were steady, but his eyes weren't. Danny stayed. That choice cost him. His relationship with his mother fractured overnight. She blamed him for ruining everything by telling the truth. She told relatives he had been manipulated too, by me, by Hudson, by guilt. Danny started therapy. Hudson insisted on it. He didn't argue. I need to understand why I did what I did, Danny told me quietly one evening when Hudson stepped out of the room. I don't want to be that person. I believed him, but believing didn't erase what was lost. Extended families split into sides. Some relatives stopped calling Hudson altogether. Others reached out privately, apologizing for believing Gianna's version without asking questions. No one apologized publicly. I learned then that people prefer comfort to correction. Gianna moved in with her sister. She told anyone who would listen that Hudson had destroyed their family over a lie, that I had exaggerated, that I had turned a mistake into a scandal. But the more she spoke, the less convincing she became. The facts didn't change, and neither did the evidence. Hudson started coming to see me more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Danny. He asked about school, about college, about how I was sleeping. He listened in a way he hadn't before, like he was trying to rebuild something carefully, brick by brick. I should have fought harder when you wanted to leave, he admitted once. I thought giving you space was respecting you. I didn't realize it was abandoning you again. I told him the truth. Leaving had saved me, but telling him the truth afterward had healed something I didn't know was still bleeding. Life with Tom and Kevin continued to feel steady, predictable in the best way. They didn't treat me like someone who needed fixing. They treated me like someone who deserved stability. My grades recovered. I slept through the night. I laughed without checking who was watching. Hudson helped me apply to colleges. He offered financial support without guilt attached. Tom and Kevin offered the same. For the first time since my parents died, I felt surrounded by adults who chose me without resentment. Gianna filed her side of the divorce papers 3 months later. Hudson signed them without hesitation. He didn't ask me how I felt about it, and I was grateful for that, because the fallout wasn't mine to carry anymore. The day Hudson told me the divorce was final, I didn't feel relief. I felt stillness. Not the numb kind, the kind that comes after a storm when the air finally settles and you can hear your own breathing again. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There was no moment where everything clicked into place and pain evaporated. Healing doesn't work that way. It moves slowly, unevenly, like learning to walk again after a long injury. But my life stopped feeling like a battlefield. I finished high school surrounded by people who asked how I was and waited for the answer. Tom and Kevin came to every school event they could. Hudson came too. sitting a few rows back, never trying to replace anyone, just showing up. That mattered more than grand gestures. Danny kept going to therapy. He never tried to excuse what he'd done. He apologized again months later, unprompted, and I accepted it because it felt honest, not because I owed him forgiveness. Rachel never reached out again, and I stopped waiting for her to. Some losses don't come with closure. Some relationships end without redemption arcs. Learning to accept that was part of growing up faster than I ever wanted to. Hudson told me once that this experience changed how he understood family. I thought protecting the peace meant staying quiet, he said. Now I know it just means choosing the loudest liar. That sentence stayed with me. So did another realization, one that took me a long time to articulate. I didn't destroy a marriage. I exposed one that was already rotting underneath the surface. I didn't take anything from Gianna's family. I stopped letting them take from me. People sometimes ask me if I regret telling the truth, if I wish I'd stayed quiet to keep things together. I don't, because staying silent almost cost me myself. What I learned, what I wish every person watching this would understand, is this. You are not ungrateful for leaving a place that hurts you. You are not cruel for telling the truth, and you are not responsible for holding together structures built on lies. Sometimes survival looks like walking away. Sometimes healing looks like speaking up. And sometimes the family that saves you is the one you choose. If you're watching this and you feel trapped somewhere you're supposed to be thankful for, please hear me. Gratitude should never require your suffering. Your life is allowed to grow beyond the house that tried to break you. And choosing yourself is not betrayal. It's survival.